Welcome back to our classrooms, folks. Listen, the guest that I have today, we've been going back and forth for a bit. I'm talking about several months now, trying to make this thing happen. She wasn't available, I wasn't available, she's traveling, I'm traveling. But here we are finally with the award-winning author of Breathe and Count Back from 10. Natalia Sylvester, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Roberto. I'm excited to be here.
Hey, my pleasure, my pleasure. Listen, I'm going to be straight up with you. I never saw myself reading a book about mermaids, but here we are. And it was good. It was good. You definitely got my attention with this book, and I appreciate the numerous themes that you covered. There's so much for us to talk about, so much for us to unpack. And one of the central themes in the book revolved around some physical challenges, particularly as it relates to the main character, Veronica, Vero, having hip dysplasia. How do you say that word?
It's dysplasia. Yeah, hip dysplasia.
Dysplasia.
Yeah.
Hip dysplasia. And talking about that journey of becoming a mermaid at Mermaid Cove. Tell us about this central theme and how you arrived there.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a lot in common with Veronica. So she's Peruvian American like me. She was born in Peru, came to the US when she was very young. And also like me, she was born with hip dysplasia, which is a condition in which your hip socket isn't quite like aligned in its socket. And so it kind of, there's all sorts of disalignment. And because of this, she was in and out of surgeries as a child like me. And I've always known that I wanted to write about this. It's been a part of my life since birth. And I just never knew like what the story that I wanted to write it in, like what story, what shape would it take? And a lot of times when I'm writing, I think a lot about particularly if I'm writing about things that might be hard or might be like layered in terms of maybe having hardship, but also having joy. I try to lean into the joy. And so I kept coming back to this idea of mermaids because when I was young, I wanted to become a mermaid. That was like my dream. And I thought, well, if I can give this character something really deep, like this deep dream that I can very much relate to, then I can have her, I can know her dreams like somewhere deep in my bones, and I can get to know her in a way that like we'll understand each other. And so that's really how I arrived at this story about Veronica. She lives in Central Florida in a town that has an attraction called Mermaid Cove, where professional performers dress up in tails underwater, and they do all sorts of underwater choreography, and they're world famous. And there is an opening for a new mermaid in her town. That's the summer before her senior year of college. And Vero wants to audition, but the only problem is that her parents are very overprotective of her, both in terms of her disability and what they think she can and can't do with her body. But they're also very overprotective of her in general. So this is also a summer which a cute new neighbor moves into her apartment complex, and Vero is crushing really hard. And her parents are also very strict about boys. And really it becomes a summer of her wanting to make decisions for herself on her own terms, both in terms of chasing her dreams, in terms of her sexuality and her love life, her kind of stepping into her own as a woman who has this whole future ahead of her and wants to be the one making the major decisions in it.
Yeah, there was a lot of tension there. Tension between Vero and the parents, and her navigating her physical disability, not just with the parents, but with how others viewed her, right? The comments that folks made. I remember towards the end of the book, Barbara made a comment about how you shouldn't cover up your scar because it's beautiful. And Veronica's response was like, why does someone always have to say something about the scar or offer something to make me feel in a particular way? Why can't they just let it be? I just want to essentially just exist.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think that, well, Vero has experienced two things with regards to her scars, and also with regards to like how she walks, and she has a limp, and she is always self-conscious about her body. But particularly with her scars, she's heard both sides of it. People have looked at it like it's ugly and really kind of in horror, and then other people might say like, oh, but it's beautiful, it's a battle scar. And really, she just doesn't want it to be either. She is like, not everything has to be a war. Like, my body isn't a war ground to be waged, right? And but also, it's not horrifying, it just is. And that's really what she wants, is to be allowed to exist without this outer gaze making all these judgments.
I was drawn in to the book for a number of different reasons. I live in Central Florida. I'm in Tampa. I haven't
Yeah.
been to what is it, Wishiwashi?
Yeah, Wikiwachi, you're right there. So
Wikiwashi.
Wikiwachi definitely inspired Mermaid Cove.
So I haven't been there yet, but there's a friend who has been there several times. It's their favorite place to go. She has like 6 kids, and she's told me about it, and I'm eager to go and bring my kids there. And now after reading the book, I'm like, when we finally go, I'm be like, yo, where the mermaids at?
Yeah.
Where the mermaids at? This is Natalia's spot. But also that Alex moved from Houston, and I've only been in Central Florida. I've been in Tampa for 2.5 years, but we moved from Texas.
Oh, I did too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I know you. I think you were in the Rio Grande Valley, which is awesome. I know a lot of people over there, and I was in Central Texas in Austin, but I also spent time in Houston and some other areas in Texas, not living there, but for different reasons. So I was really drawn in there, even thinking about Alex and his mother driving, and Alex having driven all those miles from Texas to Florida. I'm like, I drove when we moved. I drove from Texas to Florida, so I know about all the miles. I know about that journey. So I was really drawn in by some of that context and some of those details with these characters. Like I felt myself there. I also felt myself there as a parent. I think I'm somewhat protective of my children. They're young. They're 8, 5, and 3. I have 2 daughters. Just like the father in this book had 2 daughters. So there's things that I can relate with. I'm like, yo, these are my girls. These are my babies. I'm trying to keep them there as long as possible before it's time to release. And yet, and we're not at that stage yet. My kids are too young, but I know at some point we're going to cross that bridge when they're moving more towards their independence. And wow, felt that tension there, especially with the father. Right? Like, you could cut that, right? But also thinking about how much care they had for Vero, things that they shielded, fair or unfair, but things that we do as parents because we don't want our kids to hurt. We don't want them to carry the burdens. And sometimes we're holding those things, and maybe it's not necessarily the right approach, right? And I think that's part of what Vero was getting at. Like, hey, I should have known. I should have known that this was going on with my body, and I should have voice and say in the decisions as to how we proceed. Can you talk about that tension a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the tension with the parents really just came out of, it was a hard thing to write because I'm writing as an adult, right? Who I could be Vero's parent. But the story is told through Vero's point of view, and it's for readers who could really see themselves in Vero, whether they're adults with just reconnecting to that teen part in themselves, or also primarily other teens. And so I really wanted to make sure to see it through Vero's eyes, but also understand the parents' point of view. And I think it kept coming down to, like, they love her so deeply, but sometimes they become overprotective. And even though that is rooted in love, it can really stifle her. So like Vero, at the beginning of each chapter, has word definitions, and it's like the first definition is thank you. The first definition is like the dictionary definition of a word, and the second definition is her version of how she would define that word. And a lot of times those definitions are grappling with things. Like I know one of the words is suffocate. Another word is suelta, which in English and Spanish like have different kind of, or excuse, in English, well, the direct translation is let go, but in Spanish there's also it can often be used to describe like a loose woman. And this is something that also her parents are very strict about, actually about sex in general, and how she can present herself as a young woman. And so much of it, like for her, she just wishes they would let go, right? They would, let her have her independence. And for them, it becomes something about needing to figure out that journey too, of kind of trusting, like, you have to trust how you've raised this person, right? You have to trust that you've guided and taught them well to make the decisions that they'll make, and then also to make the mistakes they might make and learn from those. And so there's constantly that tension with them. And I know for a lot of people, depending on who's reading it, I've noticed that it's either too extreme that it seems to them, which is usually someone reading it who might not necessarily relate to Vero's cultural background. And then with a lot of Latinx readers, they'll just tell me like, that's so relatable. And I think that sometimes what I've found, especially with Vero's family, because they're immigrants, because she is a young woman of color, in navigating a world that has different rules for her than it may have for others, they're trying to protect her from that, but then they're also bringing their own very strict rules along with it under the guise of that protection. So it's a hard thing for them to navigate constantly, and it becomes a real source of conflict.
Yeah. And one of the things that surfaced in terms of their conflict was a reason for them being protective and for the parents, that is, and doing things the way they did things, was their status in the country. Right. So thinking about immigrants and thinking about some of the challenges that immigrants experience when they come to the United States. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so Vero came to the US. Vero and her family came to the US when she was very young. And so they have spent most of her childhood, of what she remembers, really navigating the immigration system to try and become citizens. And at this point in the book, they have finally gotten their green cards. And it's been a really hard road of, just so much waiting, so much hoping you don't make a single mistake along the way, because any wrong step can really get you, can get you in trouble, and they live in fear of being sent back. And so that feeling of instability is one that she has grown up with and that she has felt really deeply. And it really ends up coming to light, I guess, when she decides she wants to become a mermaid at Mermaid Cove, because it comes with all these different forms. It comes with her having to present her social security card. It comes with her having to sign liability waivers, and she knows her parents wouldn't go for it. And so I'm not going to spoil it, but the thing I think, for me, this idea of paperwork ended up being really a really big part of this book, in terms of the tension and the hardship that can come with that when you're an immigrant, when so much revolves around this idea of los papeles, what's going to happen if we don't get our papers? Will we be allowed to be here or will we not? And it's just a sheet of paper, but it can determine so much in your life, right? And so this idea of record keeping, for Vero, is just, it really it determines whether she's going to be able to chase her dreams, and in terms of her own body, how it relates to her disability. Like there's one passage where she reflects on the power that record keeping has had over her body her whole life, not just in terms of immigration papers, but in terms of like doctor's notes, in terms of x-rays, in terms of prescription orders. And basically she's realizing like someone else has been writing the story of my life and I want to write it for myself now.
Right. That's powerful. That's powerful. It's important for folks to take control of the narrative. It's important for folks to tell their stories, for folks to feel like they can lean into all that's impacting them. And
Yeah.
we see that with Vero. And the story delves into her quest for control over her life. And it makes me wonder about how you went about developing the character, developing the plot, and maintaining authenticity for each of the different characters, right? Like you felt the authenticity of Alex's care and empathy for Vero, but also the authenticity of his own struggles, particularly
Mm,
as it relates to depression and in the divorce of his parents. And I think that many can relate to that. Many can
mm.
relate to having experienced divorce. Many can relate to having bouts with depression. Why did you choose to also address some of those themes in your
Yeah.
book?
Yeah, so it's twofold because often when I'm writing in the first draft of a book, I'm just listening to the characters. So it was really truly Alex who one day I'm writing him and I realized, oh, Alex has depression, and this is part of his story, and you know it's been going on ever since his parents divorced and probably long before actually, and they haven't always known how to help him, right? Because I think that when we're talking about disability, we often think about the different kinds of disability. Some are more visible than others, and depression is not as visible as something like that Vero deals with, which is more
Mm,
physical and evident as she moves through the world. Um, Once I realized going into it, like, okay, so this is who Alex, this is part of this layered existence that Alex, that who Alex is, right? It just made a lot of sense to me, and it was about just listening to him. You know, there are like depression is a topic very close to my own heart and my own life, and
mm,
I really just wanted to write with as much understanding and compassion as I could for both of these characters, and I ended up having them lean into each other to find that, to really see each other and hear each other, because even though their disabilities are very different, there are places where they can overlap. You know, with Vero's, it's actually not very uncommon for a lot of people with disabilities to also have mental health issues, because if you live like Vero does with chronic pain, or like Vero does with like not always feeling heard in the needs of her body, you know, something like depression or anxiety could come up as well, right? And similar to that, I think it's why Alex understands her so well, is that she can see her struggles and not feel the need to invalidate them and not tell her, oh, it's all in your head, like he has heard many times in his own life.
mm,
So that was really important to me. And um, you know, it's interesting because I originally wrote the love interest in the very first draft. And I wouldn't even call it the first draft because it was the first chapter I was trying to write. And then I rewrote it and rewrote it. And I was like, this isn't working and this isn't working. And it was because the first time I was writing this chapter of them meeting, he actually made her very uncomfortable by looking at her scars and asking all these invasive questions about it. And I realized, like, I don't want her love interest to be someone who is already coming from this like toxic place and this place of making her feel less than. Like, I felt like she deserved to feel loved and whole, you know, in her whole self. And it doesn't mean that she had, like, I'm not trying to erase those experiences, because she's also felt, you know, dealt with other horrible experiences that show up in the book but aren't in the foreground. Like, they're not the point of the book, they're part of her experience. But in terms of like the relationship that she has that is more spotlighted in this book, I wanted it to be something that made her feel good and that made him feel good, and that they can come together without it being this like um, conflict ridden thing, because they already have enough pain and conflict in their own lives.
mm,
And I thought there would be something really beautiful in them being able to see each other and support each other through that.
mm. That's good. That's good. Can you share with share with us, share with the audience how you think this book can be utilized in a classroom setting?
Yeah, there's a few ways actually. And I found one of the ones that I've like when I've done visits, I talk a lot about language because Vero is very, she's very obsessed with language, and it's why she does these dictionary definitions, right? And so I've often used that as an exercise with other students, and it becomes a way for us to talk about the power of language, like who gets to define words, right? And the thing about words and how they get defined is that it's truly defined by us, like collectively, how we're using them over time, who is applying meaning to them. The more meaning gets attached to a word over time, it eventually gets its way into a dictionary with that usage, right? And so I think we have a lot more power in language than we realize. And I often use this exercise like Vero does at the beginning of each chapter, to look at the dictionary definition of a word and then define it based on her own words and her own terms based off of her own life experiences, and see how that definition changes, and also how how what does it make you feel in terms of the power that that word now holds, in order to kind of reflect on language and our own role in it. Another thing I love to do, because the water is such an important part of this of the book, and the water over time took a lot of different meanings for Vero, is that and the mermaids took a lot of different meanings for Vero as a result. So a lot of times I'll have students think of different sea creatures and think of like which would be the one that represents you, that you feel connected to the way that Vero feels connected to mermaids. And then why is that? And then if we take it even further, then how does that that choice impact the word choices we make, the figurative language that we use, the flow of the language, the rhythm, and that becomes that one's I found really useful in creative writing classes and things like that.
That's great. That's great. Are there common ones that come up from the students when you're presenting this?
They're always surprising. They're always so surprising. I remember one student talked about an electric eel, which was so surprising and really cool. But they were just talking about the charge of like this electric eel like moving through water, and how like you have water but you also have electricity, and the contrast between the two elements. And then I think somebody talked about, was it a narwhal, which before writing this book I never realized was a real thing. I always thought it was like a make-believe creature, but it's not. So yeah, there's just so many different ways to approach it. Other students actually created their own creature entirely. So they're now creating their own mythology, which I thought was really cool. And we talk about origin stories because, Vero talks about her own origin story as well. And so there's a lot of different directions that we often go with it.
Yeah. I noticed a few times in the book references to the birthplace that you're not familiar with, that Vero's not familiar with, and then Florida, the home that Vero knows, and I sense the character working with that tension. Can you bring me in there? Because as a Dominican American who was born in the United States, I think I've experienced that tension also, in terms of Dominican Republic not being my birth home, but being my heritage, right? It's the home of my parents. So there's a connection there, and yet still I'm like, guys, there's so much that I don't know, and I'm a lot more familiar with things over here, even though I've spent time over there. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I think a lot of times when we come from an immigrant background, whether we're first generation, second generation, regardless of our birthplace, like we do feel that constant push and pull, because there's a place that you are from, and then there's the place that shaped you and made you who you are, and they're not always the same places. And one of the things that, ended up being a guiding image for this book was really the idea of hip dysplasia in general, right? Like I mentioned, it's like you're not quite like your joint isn't quite fitting in the way that it should. And I remember there was a day when I was like, I felt that way my whole life. As an immigrant, I have felt displaced, right? I have felt out of place. I have felt like I'm not quite fitting in the way I should, and that I am like out of alignment, essentially, in the way that my joints are, the way my skeleton, my spine as a result. And this is also the case with Vero, as I think it's also the case with a lot of us who come from immigrant backgrounds, when we might not have the physical connection to the place that we're from, whether it's because we haven't been able to go back, or whether it's because we've just gone, you know, we haven't grown up there, maybe we've visited. And then the place that has shaped us become two places, and they don't always fit together in the way that maybe we see others fit. And so a lot of people, like here in the US, will always ask, where are you from? And then, as if we're not from here. And then if we have the chance to go back to our birthplace or our home country, they'll also kind of joke like, oh, la americana, right? And so it makes you just feel a bit fractured. And so this is really like, that was the idea I was working from with Vero, is that she feels very fragmented and out of alignment all the time. And she has to arrive at a point where she realizes like the power of how whole I am, or the idea of how whole I am, isn't going to come from somebody else's idea of me, isn't going to come from someone else's stamp of approval. It has to come from me, you know? And so for her to arrive at a place where she's like, you know, even if I am of two places, that doesn't have to mean I'm fractured. It could actually mean that I'm beautifully whole. Like all of these pieces are part of me and make me complete. And I think that's something that took me quite a bit of time to learn as well.
That's good. That's good. I like the way that you made that work. You know, there's a natural flow there between the hip dysplasia and the fragmentation there, and then the fragmentation with, you know, the birthplace and the place that I grew up. And so I appreciate the craftiness of your art with bringing the words together and making it flow in a way where it connects with that central theme. And I also appreciate your courage in telling your story and developing these characters in a way that draws us into conversations and content that perhaps is not necessarily the norm, right? Where we're talking about a character that's dealing with a physical disability, with hip dysplasia. I didn't even know what hip dysplasia was until I read this book. A character that is experiencing surgeries and rehabilitation, right? These things that, right, you could feel. I read that and I'm like, oh man, I feel the pain. Like I've been through a surgery. I know the pain of a surgery. It wasn't for my hip, but nonetheless, a surgery. And that was when I was what, 14, 15 years old. I could still, when I think about it, I'm like, I still feel that pain.
Yeah.
And so part of what you've done in sharing this story and being vulnerable with the character, with yourself, but also offering these details is really, at least for me and hopefully for other readers, is connect us to empathy that I think we all need, right? Just, wow, bring me into what this character's feeling and experiencing, and help me to be a little bit more informed of what other people struggle with.
Thank you. No, that means a lot. And also that it connected to you, you know, with your own memories and your own surgeries. And even though you might not have heard of hip dysplasia, like one thing I found when I talk to students is that they always find a way to relate. And particularly with disability, which disability is something that affects so many of us, and yet we don't often talk about it, because part of the conversation around disability that I think that many of us disabled people are trying to move further along is really to get rid of the stigma and the silence that's attached to it. A lot of times we even internalize this idea that to voice the needs of our bodies, and the ways that, let's say maybe if we have chronic pain, or if we need like attention, or accommodations, that we feel it might be a burden to others, right? And that's something that we need to break through, because it's really about just advocating for ourselves. And the more we advocate for ourselves, we're also advocating for others by normalizing this idea that like most of us at one point or another will deal with some sort of disability. And what I found is with students is that like a lot of times they'll tell me like, I had a surgery once, or maybe they also deal with anxiety or depression, or, and, I remember one student talking about their own scars and the ways that they related to how Vero deals with, all the questions and feelings that she has about her scars. And I just think that it shouldn't be surprising, but sometimes it is, because we all live in a body, and our bodies are also different. And even talking about the ways that the hip dysplasia is like a metaphor for how Vero walks through the world, as an immigrant. A lot of times I've found that students can feel empowered to then write about their own bodies, right? And again, on their terms, and how that what is below the surface, like that Vero deals with like all her dreams about being a mermaid, and all her like all the ways that she just doesn't want to be seen as like one thing, then can get reflected above the surface, and that we find parallels between the two. And so that's something that I love to talk about with students as well, because it's always so surprising, not just how unique their journeys are, but also how much they can interlap and find in common with one another.
That's real. So let's shift a little bit. If you had the opportunity to have lunch with anybody, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
Oh God, this was such a hard question. I kept coming back to, and I think it's because recently I've really been wondering a lot about my family history. And I think it would be my grandfather. He passed away in 2018, and I was, I feel very lucky to have had him around as long as I did. But he also has such a history that I wish I could know more about. Like he played in the Olympics for Peru. He played basketball.
Wow.
And yeah,
that's my sport.
Right? Yeah, right. And it's just like, and I got to hear a little bit about it, but it's never enough, and not just that, but just all sorts of things, like what must have seen the history of the world that he saw, like what was it like through his eyes as a Peruvian son of Italian immigrants, so I just wish I could get those moments with him.
Wonderful. What's your message of encouragement to our audience?
Oh, so something I've been thinking about lately is I think that, so when we have goals, like Vero does, for example, it's very common for us to get so hyper-focused on those goals that we don't end up nurturing all the other parts of ourselves. And so something that I've been coming back to lately is just to not be afraid to nurture all the different parts of yourself as a whole person, rather than as someone who is trying to have X goal, whether it's career, whether it's school, whether it's sports related, anything really, like, because all of the more that you're nourishing yourself as a whole person, like that's also going to serve your dreams, but there have been times in my life when if all I focus on is my writing and nothing else, the writing actually suffers, because then the part of me that's also like a wife and a daughter and a sister and an aunt and a friend and a plant obsessed dog person, all these different parts of me that they're not like being nourished. How can that whole person be putting the best part of herself into her writing when she can't? So I would say, like, just to not be afraid to really look at your needs as a whole person, because that's how you're going to bring the best version of yourself forward to the world, and to how you show up for not just yourself but your community.
Thanks for sharing.
Oh, thank you.
Where can folks follow you?
Yeah, so I am on Natalia Sylv on Instagram. I'm also on Threads, and I'm really not on Twitter anymore. So, but my handle anywhere is Natalia Syl. So I'm also, and my website is nataliasylvester.com.
And is
So I'm
that the
always
place?
happy.
Is that the best place for folks to purchase your book?
Yeah, actually, so Breathing Count Back from 10 is available at any bookstore. But definitely if you go to my website, you'll find a link to my local independent store, which is where you can also find signed copies if you're interested in that. So yeah.
Bueno, it was a pleasure, Natalia. So great to be with you, to learn from you, to just dig into this book and unpack all these themes. Wishing you great success and looking forward to reading more of your content. Thank you
Thank you,
for all
Roberto.
that you offered us, and keep writing in a courageous manner. Keep being bold about the stories that you share and the topics that you address. We definitely need more writers who are changing the narrative and normalizing the conversations that sometimes feel taboo for us.
Thank you. I appreciate that.